A real pleasure for me to have a wonderful panel to talk about the topic of steel and watches. At the far end, Aldous Hodge, who I always refer to as the Renaissance man. Almost everybody here will know of his career in movies. He was in Hidden Figures, Big Mama's House, Straight Out of Compton, things like that. A hit TV series with Kevin Bacon called City on a Hill, and several others. Broadway appearances. He is a violin player. He's a painter. He is a member, actually trustee, of the Orological Society of New York. And because he doesn't have enough to do, he has founded his own watch brand and has a watch in, I would say, advanced state of development at this point.
Yeah.
Aldous, great to have you here.
It's great to be here.
And next to Aldous is Tim Masso, who is a star of media himself. He is the director of media for Watchbox, and I'm sure all of you have seen his many videos reviewing watches. And closest to me is Paul Boutros, who is head of watches for the Americas for Philips. He actually founded this group for Philips. They've had a couple of minor auctions with things like the $17.5 million Paul Newman watch, which Paul organized for them. So we have wonderful experts with us here today, and I'm going to throw this out kind of in no one particular direction, so as long as we all don't chime in at once, we'll get some different views. What in the world is going on that makes steel so popular right now?
I'll make an opening comment. People always want what they can't get. In high-end watches from top-tier brands, they make very few examples in steel, and I'm talking brands like Audemars Piguet, Patek Philippe, Vacheron Constantin, Elanga, and Zone. They create these extremely well-finished, high-grade movements, and they prefer to case these jewels of movements in precious metals. So historically, since the 1930s, 40s, 50s, when they were making wristwatches in much fewer numbers, the vast majority of their movements were in precious metal cases. So they're trained not to really want to put those movements in steel. Today, they do, and they have very popular models, and they're more affordable. And because more people can own them, the demand is just so high for them. So those are my opening comments.
So I am Tim. Welcome to WatchTime. But I think the thing to remember about steel is that scarcity is always relative to demand, and if I had to put a finger on what's different this time as we're seeing prices swell, it's the influence of social media. Back in the 1990s, the Rolex Daytona in steel was a waitlisted watch. People paid big markups to own them used. But there wasn't a social media ecosystem to cause that watch's price to double, triple, or even quadruple. So when you look at all of the watches that are currently very hyped, very sought, inflated, pre-owned, a lot of that is all produced by a social media ecosystem of Twitter and TikTok and Facebook and, of course, Instagram, which is the 800-pound gorilla. People didn't know how much they wanted this stuff until they started seeing it online, and that's sort of how we get to here, almost regardless of brand.
Right. What's up? Good morning or afternoon. I don't know. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just waking up. But definitely all of those points. Just to piggyback, yes, scarcity is a factor. The gray market is a huge factor. In terms of production, number, and models, all of these elements collectively point towards the results that we see today when it comes to the idea of steel and its intrinsic value. I'm not necessarily sure people are preferring steel over precious metals for the sort of genetic makeup of the metal, because for all intents and purposes, steel is in many ways superior to gold or to a platinum. When you're talking about tensile strength, durability, the fact that it is hyperallergenic. The fact that steel is not going to the luster, the color of the steel is not going to change over time the way gold will. You know, so technically it does have superior facets and assets to it, but we work off the gold standard, which sort of moves the motion for marketing and for how certain of these, you know, really fantastic watches kind of get put out. It's pushed off of the idea of luxury, commodity, rarity. But watches, as they have moved into an asset class, primarily being allocated for or acquired for the idea of not just appreciating the art, but also the future prospect of its growth in value. Steel has now usurped gold or other precious metals in specific ways because of its rarity and because of the story behind it, such as with the Patek, 1518 that sold, I think it was like 12 million or something like that, because they had many more models made in gold, but they only had like 4 of those in steel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, the 1518 is a great example. This is a historic Patek Philippe model, the world's first serially produced perpetual calendar with chronograph wristwatch, introduced in 1941, right in the midst of World War II. They produced that model for about 10 years in about a little bit less than 300 total examples, and of that production, 80% were yellow gold, about 20% were pink gold, and just 4 examples known in stainless steel.
Right.
And again, it goes to the point where these brands have these really precious movements, and they couldn't imagine putting them into steel because it's a pedestrian type of metal compared to gold and platinum.
Yeah.
However, in the time of war, people could not afford the precious metal watches. They could afford stainless steel. So in order to help them sell timepieces, you see a significant increase in production during the World War II years from all of the brands, actually, as fewer people could afford those watches in precious metal.
Right.
I have just one observation to make. So back when I was getting interested in watches, which is basically when dinosaurs were ruling the earth, it always seemed like you had to have a precious metal watch if it was an important watch, because it would feel that way on your wrist. You would put the steel watch on and you would think, no, it doesn't feel like much, and you put on the gold watch and now it's feeling good, and you put on platinum and it even feels better.
Right.
Have we just tossed out the idea of heft being a characteristic of the watch that is prized or not?
I'm going to just quickly opine that there are 2 different types of steels as far as the market's concerned. There's vintage steel, as Paul was discussing. That has been a thing for well over a decade. Those auction results go way back. That is not a short-term trend, whereas when you're looking at people paying 400,000 euros plus a buyer's premium for a current year Nautilus in steel, that's a very different phenomenon. They're not driven by the same root causes. I think you see the same thing with the $40,000 steel Rolex Daytona that retails for $13,150. You see the exact same thing with stainless steel Omega watches like the Ed White, for example. Now people are marking those up on secondary markets. That's a watch that just came out in the last 12 months. So there's a big difference between what's happening with steel among modern watches and what I see as a more durable long-term trend driven by scarcity among vintage watches and steel. These 2 things I believe to be very different, driven by disparate root causes.
Yeah, so I want to reorient now toward new watches, current production watches, and what used to be a prized characteristic of a production watch was that extra weight. Has that disappeared as something that's desirable? Have tastes changed, which could have an effect on this popularity of steel?
If I may, I guess at the turn of the century, a brand that many of you may have heard of, Richard Mille, inverted the notion, that very notion, that a premium luxury watch needs to be heavy. So he introduced lightweight materials, cases in titanium, aluminum, silicon carbide, these high carbon materials, which are basically types of plastics that are ultralight, and completely changed the game when it comes to the feeling of prestige being heft. Instead, now ultralightness is the ultimate luxury, which nobody would have fathomed in the 20th century. And steel, of course, is lighter than gold, it's lighter than platinum, So, I mean, I think today people are now thinking that it doesn't have to be heavy to be sought after and desirable.
I would concur.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
No, I was just saying, I would definitely concur in terms of, I mean, back in the day, people would grab a watch, they would feel they have to, this is, what is this? 34 ounces of gold? No, there was, the value proposition attached to the actual piece was encompassing the weight, because the idea of a heavier watch meant more material. Heavier watch, more gold. There you go. It's like, boom, it's worth more value if I have to melt this thing down and push it out. But speaking of Paul's point about how Richard Mille did change the perception of what value is as it comes to the composite material, there's where you kind of get into the battle between steel and titanium.
That's where I wanted to go. So
Right.
does this open the door to make titanium maybe the new thing? Thinking of the fact that titanium is even lighter than steel, harder than steel, less allergenic than steel.
So I'll say, go ahead.
No, I don't want to.
From a manufacturing standpoint, titanium is a far more expensive metal, and it is a much more, it's a much harder metal to work with in terms of, dealing with CNC machines. You are definitely breaking your drill tips a bit more often. The melting point is a little bit higher than steel. It's also, in terms of malleability, more resistant to extremes of heat and cold than steel. So it's like there are different properties on, and I guess when you get to very specific points about what makes either or superior, but titanium is always going to be more expensive to manufacture. Therefore, the idea that it may be more expensive to when it comes to retail price and retail market may stand as the standard, right, in terms of that initial retail push. As far as the aftermarket, that's something that we, the manufacturers, don't really control. That goes to the consumer and the collector base and the collector culture. So that is something that I'm not sure if the gray market is what pushes the valuation of what we produce and how we put it out, because you may have a model that's, $20,000 and it pushes on the gray market for $60,000, and you're like, well, do I have to mark up now? But is it really about the metal, or is it about the culture and how they treat the particular metal? Are we in charge of the marketing, or is the watch collecting culture in charge? Because steel versus titanium, they each have different properties that are superlative in ways that come down to preference of the consumer. But also, a thing with steel is it has a very particular color. It's also a little darker. Some may say a little bit more smokier or richer than steel. So there's a determining factor where steel, you're going to definitely be able to play with better color options in terms of the manufacturing, the manipulation of its hue. Titanium, not so much. So you're a little bit limited in different ways with options aesthetically. But as it relates to how they are consumed, titanium typically is going to be a little bit more expensive putting out. But then as far as its after-sales value, I think it's in the hands of the consumer.
Yeah, Tim, do you see that we're going to be witnessing more titanium coming onto the market with the success of steel on the market?
I suspect we will. What I don't think, though, is that we're going to see a lot of phenomenon-level watches added to the list. Like, here's the thing. If Patek Philippe decided to make a titanium 5711, it would break the internet. Chopard just decided to make a titanium Alpine Eagle with a high beat escapement, and no one wants it. I think that the current phenomenon we're seeing across markets is really brand and model dependent, which is why an F. Journe Chronomètre Bleu, a dress watch in tantalum, is a $26,000 watch that becomes a $120,000 watch, but at the same time, you and I can go out and buy Vacheron, Patrimonies, and Traditionnel dress watches all day long in precious metal. I think the Rolex Daytona, the GMT, of course the Submariner, now the Oyster Perpetual 41 are very hot watches. But if you want to go out and buy a steel Yachtmaster 2, or God help us, a precious metal Yachtmaster 2, you've got your pick. And that was the case right up until a few years ago with the precious metal Daytonas too. But they followed the market for the steel Daytona. You can't buy the platinum watch for $55,000, $65,000 anymore. You can't get the gold, yellow or white, for $32,000, $33,000 anymore. So I really do believe that what we're seeing in the current marketplace, yes, steel is taking a starring role, but I also think we're seeing a huge phenomenon around specific brands and models within those brands. And that's really where the outrageous auction results and sale prices and shortages and wait lists are forming.
Although, just to disagree slightly, we're seeing more and more brands that had resisted steel. In other words, resisted a non-precious metal coming out with precious metal. The poster child for that is Lange, which for years and years and years said no steel, except they made a very small number of loaner watches when you sent your watch in for service, which was a program that ended quickly. But they joined the party. Is there anybody that's not going to do a steel type watch now? Paul, I mean, what do you see?
So I think because of accessibility and because of the market demand, they have to produce steel watches. It either do it or be left in the dust. Going back to the question of titanium, I don't see it picking up. I don't see brands thinking, you know what, let me make a pivot and choose to create watches in titanium versus steel. Patek Philippe, Rolex, these are the, let's call them the 800-pound gorillas in the watch world, and really trends are created by them because they're so conservative and so careful in how they evolve their models, that if they did decide to introduce a titanium line or watches in titanium in mass production, not unique pieces, then we may see some changes. But without the adoption by those dominant brands, I don't think we'll see titanium ever being a significant contender to steel.
How much of this relates not to the fact that it's steel, but this trend towards sport for everything? Is steel then conflated with sport? So if sport is what people want, and if you're going to do sport, you do steel. Is it working that way?
I would just add that with the Lange's Odysseus, it's important to remember that both the white gold and the steel models are highly sought. I think the big Rubicon that was crossed there was the decision to make a Lange sports watch, not necessarily the decision to make it in steel, because the white gold is just as unobtainable.
I think in terms of the craze of steel or manufacturers pushing into steel where they haven't before, from a manufacturing side, there's probably a few different theories at play. One is sustainability and affordability. I mean, you can only go so far and do so much staying at a high rate, at a high class when it comes to a price point for something. But case in point, if you're making a model, maybe if you make a case in steel, say it costs you per unit, your per unit cost is like maybe $10,000, $11,000 to produce that particular watch in steel. You want to produce that case in gold, you're looking at an extra $10,000. So now multiply that by 500 times for 500 units that you got to put out, and then you got to go sell these things and make your margins and make it back, right?
By the way, you're talking like a watch brand now. you feel this pain.
Yeah, I feel it because I'm going through it right now. I'm midway through, actually about, I'd say 70-way through my R&D, but I worked as a conceptual designer for many years. That, not too many people know about, but for over 10 years, over 15 years in the design game, and in terms of learning the business, learning the market, understanding trends and where to really put your weight and your effort, because if you design something, you're spending 2-3 years on it, you put it out, you want to make sure that by the time you're done with it, it's going to move off the shelf, right? So how do you sort of predict that? A lot of it, I think, in terms of right now, there's been a big boom with the steel interest that has made headlines, and because the name steel at this particular point is synonymous with success, whereas that used to be gold, that used to be platinum, that used to be the white gold. Right now, steel has become sexy again. I think there's a cyclical nature in terms of interest. It's always going to be this or this or this. There's going to be something that pushes it. What we saw that, at least from my observation, I don't know all the details, but from sort of a civilian perspective, what I saw over the last couple of years is the big interest when it came to the steel Royal Oaks. Of course, Rolex has always been a staple, but then we see, what is it, the 5711, that, one steel 5711 can buy you several gold 5711s. And you got to sit there and you're like, why? What happened? Who did this? And now the marketability of that watch for a brand substantiates their placement for the collector. As far as the collector to have this very particular rare steel model, it then substantiates their place amongst the collecting field to say, I have this rarity right here. So is it so much about the material in itself, or is it about how the culture is looking at the particular material at the time and what that says about the person who has or is in control of distributing that material? Who gets the market share for that?
Well, one element here that we kind of haven't touched on yet is that these super popular steel pieces all have steel bracelets as opposed to alligator or some other material type bracelet, and that gives it a certain kind of look. Is there some fashion element now with it where it is cool to be flashing that steel bracelet, whereas a dressier watch with an alligator strap or crocodile strap is not as classy?
So it goes to your question, actually, and what I think, Tim, you had mentioned about the current demand for sports watches and our lifestyle. Many of you in this room don't wear a suit to work. Many of you are actually working from home still, and you're kind of casual. The formal dress watches, precious metals with alligator straps, they complement a suit very well. But when you're wearing jeans, when you have a much more casual lifestyle, a sports watch really fits. And they're so easy to wear. So if you've been collecting for a while and you've had the, highly complicated precious metal dress watches from the top brands, you know that if you accidentally drink too much one night and you knock your watch on a doorknob, it's a car accident. If you knock your stainless steel sports watch on that doorknob, especially if it's a true sports watch like a Rolex or an Omega Speedmaster, it's a ding and nobody's going to care because they expect a sports watch to have those dings and scratches. So ease of wear, just practicality has made sports watches, especially with our current lifestyle, with more and more people going to work casual, dressing casual for most occasions, the sports watch fits and it's part of the lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And the stainless steel bracelet is part of that because you don't have to worry about the strap getting old, getting wet, and replacing it. The steel bracelet is so easy.
Yeah. And speaking to that point, sometimes depending on what the watch is, those dings and those notches tell a story that can actually raise the value of the watch. Yeah. So people buy vintage pieces or, and they're like, no. Don't buff it out. Don't leave it as is. That's my watch. I know what it looks like. But leave all the notches because it does tell a story, Oh, no. Didn't want to cut short. Oh, I could only imagine the case of Paul Newman. It's probably got a few dings on there that people want to keep. Which, by the way, some of the most expensive watches, the most expensive watch in the world, was in a steel case.
Was cheap, and it was unsellable. The Paul Newman, the one that sold for $17.8 million, a stainless steel sports watch from the 1960s and 70s. That watch was produced in 1967 or 68. Mm-hmm. At that time, nobody wanted it.
Yeah.
It was unsellable. And Rolex would have to throw in that watch. If you bought a gold day date, hey, we'll give you this at 50% off.
Yeah.
And see how times have changed. Now the Daytona is the hottest watch on the planet, but Paul Newman's wife did not think about desirability. Yeah. She thought about practicality. She bought him that watch for a purpose. He got into motorsport, and she wanted him to be able to tell time in his car races.
Rolex proved themselves to be very practical devices. They were one of the very first brand, if not the first brand, to have a wristwatch certified as a chronometer, so that they really validated the actual usage of it in terms of daily life, because back in the day it was just, pocket watches. So they had there was a tangibility to their actual function, but then when it came to the lifestyle, Rolex kind of overtook, or rather, I'm not sure if it was the culture that overtook, but they were adapted and applied to the cultural lifestyle, where Rolex is now basically the luxury standard, not even just for the watch industry, but they are for the luxury world all around. They are synonymous with that. So, you know, and I think the cool factor of Paul and who he is kind of added to that, you know what I mean? But, you know, speaking to that, yes, that was, what, 17.7 million. Then there was the Grandmaster Chime, the Patek Grandmaster Chime was at 6,300 reference A. Yeah, it was 31 million.
Stainless steel.
Stainless steel. Most expensive watch sold, wristwatch sold.
I do want to throw this out there that there's a big difference between Patek piece unique watches made for charity and vintage pieces like, for example, vintage 1518s or Paul Newman's 6239, because that market is more or less durable and long-term, whereas, I'm going to be totally honest, guys, we're in a bubble right now for a lot of brands and models. Prices are not sustainable. That Patek, the 5711 1A14 that sold for 400,000 euro plus premium, that's a $34,890 watch. You can't continue to see values accelerate at that rate. It's just not sustainable. So I'm going to say just on that front, prices are best described as a product of cheap money from central banks for years and years and years. And then basically the interaction of that factor with social media and people being exposed intensely to a small number of watches and brands. I would also like to say that there's always the flows of fashions, the ebb and the flow. Back in the 2000s, everyone was about rubber straps, and people were putting rubber straps all over expensive watches. In the 2010s, at least for the first 7-8 years of it, everyone was beguiled by NATO straps, and you were seeing NATO straps on Patek dress watches. Now the bracelet, which has always been around, is coming back into fashion. So I think this is very cyclical. It's a combination of interest in sports watches, interest in steel as a sort of fashion statement, interest in bracelets for the same reason, and then a lot of very cheap money interacting with social media induced demand.
Right.
Yeah, I think Tim had a really good point that we have changed definitions of the kinds of watches you wear in certain circumstances. That's entirely fashion. A metal bracelet watch that used to be jeans only, you could wear with a tux.
Right.
Today. That's today's fashion. That might not be true in 10 years from now.
Yeah.
I mean, I can remember when the rule for a really formal thing was 3-hand watch. No complications, no fancy bracelet, slim, small, whatever. Now just anything goes.
Yeah.
Right?
If I may comment on what Tim had mentioned about a bubble. So, speaking from an auction house's perspective and a longtime collector, I've never seen the market as strong as it is today. And for the factors that Tim mentioned, absolutely, you know, a great injection of inexpensive money, social media influences, you know, just targeting people to specific types of watches. Never before have so many people discovered watches. We have so many new people who never even thought about watches coming to us. And for me, who was the freak growing up, the only person around all my circle of friends who liked watches, I love it. Now those old friends who used to make fun of me are like, Paul, can you help me buy a watch? So watches have become mainstream. So I don't know if it's a bubble or just a huge amount of people coming into this market that just weren't there before.
And I wanted to comment on that as well, because I don't disagree with you. There may be a bubble. I think more or less that it's not a bubble that would necessarily pop, but it does circulate because, as I've noticed and I mentioned a couple of times, watches has moved into an asset class where a lot of times people are asking, hey, what watch can I buy that's going to appreciate and double and triple in value? And you're in terms of the auction space or the charitable space with those watches that we see those crazy valuations, that's a whole different ether. That's a different universe. But what happens is when those watches prices hit the market and hit the world and then they actually make news, they sort of inflate interest and create or add to the trend. So then you start seeing, because of the casing, because of this, you start seeing a spike in the interest and the acquisition of certain, models of the similar type. So it's not the general defining factor, but it's an asset too, or it definitely affects the market where its purchase sort of creates a resounding effect that we sort of see kind of play out over the years with the culture, and then we see how they take it, and then to a degree, as we are talking about it now, kind of responding to it to figure it all out,
I would also say that it's important to look at what else is surging in prices right now.
Right.
People are paying ridiculous amount of money for NFTs, cryptocurrencies. Used cars are up 25% since this time last year. You're seeing an explosion in speculative investment in stocks like Tesla, which is, from a profitability standpoint, a very ordinary mid-sized automaker, but its stock trades at over 100 times forward earnings. That's not rooted in reality. There are a lot of new people coming into watches, and that's a very good thing. I don't think they're driving the market for really high-end steel watches. And if you look at the entry level of the market for steel watches, right now the Oris Aqua State Caliber 400, it's a $3,500 watch. You can get it for about $3,000 pre-owned. Omega Seamaster Diver 300 meter in steel, a real good equivalent and substitute for a Rolex Submariner. That's a $5,200 steel watch, full bracelet, that sells for about $4,800, $4,700 used. So I do think at the top of the market, we're looking at some unsustainable trends, but as Paul and Aldous kind of brought into the discussion, there are also people coming in at the bottom of the market who are buying lower priced watches, increasing the volumes of what we would still consider luxury, and maybe that is where we'll find the sustained interest in steel over time, as a younger generation, maybe two, comes in and buys those cheaper steel watches. Yeah. But in the world of the Nautilus, the 41mm Oyster Perpetual, Aquanauts, even now the Vacheron Overseas, we're seeing unsustainable pricing trends.
Yeah, it is crazy.
So I want to know, we've been talking men's watches, and what we are buying, for whether it's a tuxedo or the beach or auction markets where we think a lot of money will be made. What about steel for women's watches? Is that going to take off, or are we talking about an entirely male-driven image of what should be worn?
Well, I haven't really seen anything linked specifically between fluctuations in the market for steel watches that are marketed towards women. But something that is hard to quantify is that there are a lot of female customers who buy general watches that are primarily marketed to men, right? For me, I know there's a distinguishable difference in terms of how the marketing goes out, and some pieces that are made for women versus certain pieces that are made for men. I always look at every piece as asexual, because I look at, there's a lot of female collectors that I know of who just buy pieces, usually bigger pieces, their grandfather's watch, they call it the boyfriend size, or, but they just appreciate horology, and sometimes the interesting things that they appreciate aren't made to be marketed towards them. So I'm not sure where that goes, but I do know that as steel increases in interest, I look at it from the macro view of saying it includes all collectors, and instead of, because it's impossible to kind of carve it out. But as when it comes to I think a manufacturing standpoint, I have not yet seen manufacturers push into the women's market with steel as a leading,
Except I would say the grand exception to that would be the Patek 24 for women, which is actually, in truth, if I've got my numbers right, their hands down biggest seller by a lot.
Stainless steel.
Yeah, in stainless steel.
Yeah, number one.
Yeah.
Also worth mentioning, and I'll just really picked up on this, a lot of women who are into watches as more than a one-off accessory really do get into mid-sized men's watches, unisex options, and vintage. And I can tell you from my YouTube analytics, and I get millions of views, 97% of my audience is male on YouTube. So it's very much a male-dominated hobby. And the small number of women who kind of try to crack a hobby that is not geared towards them often are turned on by men's watches in wearable sizes. And I've conducted a number of interviews with female collectors to see what they actually chose for themselves, even when budget wasn't a consideration. And it's going to be a lot of stuff along the lines of the 35 to 38 millimeter male intent luxury watch.
Yeah, Tim, you're spot on. One example I can give is that Breguet noticed in their boutiques a large number of women interested in the tradition watch. They were just buying the men's watch, and Breguet said, gee, we can do a couple of things with this and take that watch and put a different kind of bracelet on it and so forth and so on, and it's become extremely popular.
So in my humble opinion, the very best watches with the most enduring value, with the most enduring appeal, are those watches that fit the most wrist types. Watches designed from the get-go to be cultureless, to be genderless, they just fit wrists well. It happens to be, maybe the 35 to 38 millimeter diameter range.
This was 37 millimeters. So
but even 40 millimeter watches can, if they're designed right, can sit on wrist sizes of all types. Men, women, no matter what. And those are the best watches out there that will stand the test of time. When we look at the watches that perform best at auction, it's really those watches that fit people's wrists well. My saying to collectors, if the watch fits you really well, you will have long-term satisfaction with it. If it doesn't fit you well, you're going to want to get rid of it. You're not going to want to go to that watch. And so for anyone, male, female, try on the watch. And you're going to be surprised that what looks great in a picture or in a shop window, once you put it on your wrist, man, that doesn't fit. And just look for those classic sizes, well-designed lugs, great proportions. And that's really the secret to wearing success and collector success with a watch. And I do see quite a few female collectors who I know are real collectors, and it's great to see you all here.
Yeah. So I want to drive us in a slightly different direction and bring a new dimension into thinking about where a non-precious metal belongs and where it can succeed in the market. What do we think about steel for high-end complications? Not sport watches, but if I want to cite an example, Max Buser does titanium, a non-precious metal, for his $170,000 Swiss franc, which is even more in U.S. dollars, more like 180, legacy machine perpetual. Well, we've seen some. Francois Pauljourne used steel for his sonories because he liked the sound. Is that something we could imagine expanding?
Well, let me just. I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead. No, just go ahead, bro.
Okay, the Grunewald stopped taking orders. A large number of their orders were steel. None of their watches are sports watches. This year we saw three major steel debuts from Patek Philippe. One of them was a Nautilus, but the other two were the 4947 annual calendar and the 5905 flyback chronograph annual calendar. Neither one of those is a sports watch. They're both very dressy, but they're also full bracelet in steel. So I would say the trend in high horology, if you look at what's being done in smaller manufacturers like Grunewald, what's being done at haute horlogerie brands like Vacheron with their steel 1942 Historique, or the Corne de Vache chronograph in steel at Patek now with full bracelet dress complications, chronographs, annual calendars, automatics, all of that in steel. I think there is an attempt by the manufacturers to see whether this is a durable trend and a change in tastes. If they can port it over to dress watches, then the answer is probably going to be yes. If the only steel watch you can sell is a sports watch, then the answer is probably no.
I feel like, for me, when I think about steel, the manufacturing process, there's nothing special, no differentiating factors between producing a steel case versus a precious, a white gold or a rose gold case outside of the metal amalgamation that you have to create for that particular piece, right? So how much value does that actually add to what the watch is, the design of the watch, the manufacturing of the movement? So when I see a complicated movement inside of a steel case, the thing that I take from that is the manufacturer, and typically we see it with a lot of the indies, the manufacturer communicating to the audience saying, hey, look, this is this price because of the work that goes into what you're actually getting, which is the movement, which is that history, which is the DNA of the brand, right? So everything here is valuable. We are moving outside of the world's norms for the metal standards, the gold standard, the platinum, the this, and we're saying this right here is valuable because of what it is wholly, right? You're paying 170 for, yes, that steel case, but also that movement that took 5, 6, 10 years to really develop. And I like the focus, or rather the conversation that gets started around where that focus is put towards the actual engineering that goes into the piece. I mean, my first round is going to be all steel, primarily just because I would like to see what the audience feeds back, what they say, how they feel about it. Do you get an actual feeling from it, right? It's not so much about the metal. It's about putting a conversation out there to see what the world gives me back, and from there, that's how I kind of gain my data analytics to see where I go from. I don't allow it to necessarily dictate my flow, but when we see, you know, when I think about MB&F in a steel case, I don't think about the steel. I think about the fact that MB&F is just awesome. So you could put it in paper, I'm going to get it. I don't really care. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know what I mean? But they've done such a great job with their branding and the sort of cultifying the culture of what they do and how they do it. MB&F to me signifies true horological imagination, right, and creativity. And there's a freedom in that because he takes chances. He does a lot of crazy things that you're like, this doesn't work on paper, and then you see it, you're like, oh, wow, that's very cool, right? So there's a real cool factor that goes into it. So brands like that can produce models with complications inside of them, put them in steel, and now those brands are in front of redefining the perspective of that metal, that steel.
Well, you said something really interesting, that your plan is to test the waters with your new watch, debuting in steel?
That was not a plug, by the way. I'm just speaking as a manufacturer to give how we think sometimes.
Yeah. So that's your initial idea?
Yeah. I want to, you know, steel, again, when I think about materials and metals, I think about the options that it gives me. I understand the options that I want to get from steel as it performs over years in terms of durability, in terms of color, tarnishing, things like that. There are different things that I look at sort of in a micro way that allows me to test where I sit as a horologist. So I don't necessarily think about the value of it tied to where we sit today, because that value is going to change, and it constantly fluctuates, and I don't want to chase something that I can't necessarily control or contain. I just want to see what my true value is in this space, and then that will tell me where I go and where I actually sit for the next, you know, iteration, the Model 2, Model 3, or whatever, but it allows me to test. Because if I start out with something in rose gold, then the valuation of it, oh, this is attached to gold. I don't want my valuation to be distinguished or determined by gold. I want it to be determined by the product.
But it's interesting because there actually is one independence, because there are two brothers who started the same way. The Grunefeld's first 20 watches, the 1 Hertz, were all in steel.
Steel, yeah.
And their movements are made of steel.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is very unusual.
I will say that sometimes steel isn't enough to save a watch, because there are a lot of great watches being made by desirable independents that are in steel. I would throw out the advantage or the example of Moritz Grossmann and Laurent Ferrier, which are both excellent manufacturers making beautiful watches. But it's confounding to me why the Grunefelds are sold out with an endless wait list on every model, regardless of material, and yet here from these independents in Germany and Switzerland and Grossmann and Ferrier, we have some of the nicest looking watches front and back in the business, but even in stainless steel, people aren't biting. So I really do feel like what we're looking at with steel is highly model dependent and brand dependent. I think you do yourself a favor if you're launching a new brand and you launch first in steel or titanium, but I don't necessarily think the interest specifically today is steel, since I can think of so many examples of steel watches, even sports watches. Parmigiani would love for you to go out and buy the Tonda GT annual calendar chronograph on a full bracelet. That's a $21,500 watch. It's like $16,000, $17,000 used, and it's only been out for about 24 months. Also, you look at Breguet and you look at the Marine. the post-2018 marine and steel or titanium has never sold well. And it's important to acknowledge that as good as these watches are and as essential to the market's tastes as they seem to be, there's just not a branding there that sells, or there's not a model recognition that sells. And I think another example that certainly we've all got some experience with is Blancpain, which forever has made high complications, perpetual calendar chronographs, flyback chronographs, triple calendars in stainless steel or titanium and ceramic, and those haven't sold as well as I think they should based on how good the mechanisms and the designs are. So what we have is a fickle market with a lot of money floating around, fixated on very few models and brands.
So since we've been focusing on steel and the color of steel, where does that put platinum these days? Is that the forgotten material in this rush to all have the supposedly discreet, non-flashy metal?
No way. No way. Platinum still is an ultimate material. And when we're talking about Nautiluses, Audemars Piguet Royal Oaks, Rolex Daytonas, platinum is still very, very sought after, and they command significant premiums over retail.
Also worth mentioning, just look at the platinum Rolex Daytona. This is why I say these things are very brand and model dependent. 2-3 years ago, I used to tell people, go out, buy the platinum Daytona. Get one to wear and one to keep in the safe, because this won't be forever. You'll be able to buy this watch out of a dealer case without a wait, or buy it used for less than retail. Now, that's still a roughly $75,000 watch, but they now sell used for about $120,000 in some cases. So if platinum is used in the correct model, if an Arabic numeral platinum Middle East edition date comes to market, there's going to be a feeding frenzy, and the platinum Daytonas are no longer cheap. I do think when you've got a white gold platinum bezel Yachtmaster 2, nobody wants that watch. So it's going to be hugely dependent on what model and brand you're being offered, because I think the alchemy that awakens the modern, certainly auction bidder, but also retail collector, it's going to be an emotional rapport with a model or a brand that he really likes.
So I see a message coming out here. You got to be good, and you've got to market well. It's not going to be your metal that does it for you.
Marketing is key. Marketing is the messaging. You know what I mean?
If I may add to my answer, elite collectors, they want the best. They want the very best, and they will pay a premium. And the brands, when they produce their prestigious model in platinum, that's a statement. That is the best of what they can make. It will have the highest retail price because platinum is a bear to work with, as I'm sure you know, Aldous.
It's terribly difficult. It's hard. Platinum is hell to work with.
Yeah, well, which is not to say
Worth it.
titanium is a picnic, because the machines can burst into flame working on that hard metal.
Yeah.
So-
And the production is inherently limited, so they're rare. And for me, platinum is an apex metal for collectors' watches.
So I think we have time for a few questions. Hopefully we have somebody to manage the microphone. So let me throw it to our audience here. We have... Hello?
Yeah, so firstly, thanks for the session. It was very informative.
Not live.
Yeah, I think, so firstly, thanks for the session. It was very informative. So this question about steel, I also have like a theory that some of the steel models are more desirable because, like for example, Submariner, right? Submariner was a diving watch. So it doesn't really make sense from its DNA point of view to have it in gold. So do you think that having it a watch in steel also kind of makes a difference on what it was meant for? So if it's a diving watch, people would pay more for a diving watch, which is a true diving watch, which would be in steel and not in gold. Mm-hmm. On the contrary, like a date, it's fine to have it in gold because it's a dress watch.
So, just off top, I don't think many collectors are buying a Submariner to actually dive with. So I think that and I say that because there are many watches that are not bought for their intended purpose, right? For why they were made. There's a lot of people walking around with chronographs that don't necessarily know how to properly use a chronograph, and that's not a knock. It's some people buy it specifically to just appreciate what it is. And again, I mean, Rolex has a hold on the market share that is it's unfathomable. So the fact that it is a Rolex, then you look at its market, its value in the market. Then you look at what it is, a Submariner. You look at the culture behind it. You look at what it is. People are buying into the culture of it more than buying the actual tool. They're more than the thing. You know, it's not necessarily about buying a time-telling device at that point or something you can dive with. It's about buying what presence or image or value it gets back for you just by owning it.
Well, I mean, if you want the perfect example, it really is in your head. So we've had moon phase watches that were accurate for the moon for 122
Right.
years that were manual wind. So nobody will ever know whether it actually achieved that accuracy. And I
Right.
think Strahler did one that was accurate
1,000 years
for
even.
a million years or some
Yeah.
ridiculous kind of number, but it's in your head. You
Yeah.
know, I've got a diving watch, it can dive. I don't dive, but it's in my head.
Yeah, but for sure, and Aldous, you were saying the resistance and resilience of stainless steel as a metal, its corrosive resistance properties, makes that an ideal metal for that purpose. But yeah, these watches were designed for professional divers in the 1950s. That's their genesis.
It exists. If it came to market at an auction,
Yeah, there are a handful of them that were actually produced by Rolex, but if Rolex made them as far as regular production pieces, you would see demand very high, like we saw with the Sky Dweller. The Sky Dweller was initially introduced in precious metal cases. It was a slow seller. Rolex just pivoted, introduced them in stainless steel, and now it's the hottest annual calendar on the market.
I would also say, realistically, looking at the recovery of values for yellow gold and white gold Submariners, there is absolutely no doubt that the strength of the model and the surge of interest in Submariners generally has significantly brought up the price of those solid gold full bracelet subs that used to sell for thousands below retail as used watches. No one wanted a Smurf. No one wanted a yellow Smurf. And it was just the kind of thing where people looking for subs weren't interested in spending that kind of money or paying a premium, especially with the white gold models that looks to most people like steel. And now those are back up to the point where people are paying premiums to get them used, and the white gold model, not surprisingly, is worth more. And you know, I do credit that to the interest in white metal cases, titanium, steel, platinum, white gold. But we're no longer seeing the precious metal versions of popular models unwanted. Now, as Aldous mentioned, 5711s, for example, in rose gold, are worth less than steel, and that's still the case. But I do think that any model that's really hot will ultimately see every variant thereof inflated to a higher price.
Right.
Do we have some other questions?
Thank you for a great discussion. Paul, I had a question for you, well, I guess primarily because you're from an auction background. You mentioned earlier in the discussion that the 1518 in steel is desirable because there are only 4 of them. So it's not necessarily that it's sealed, it's just the rarity of it. Are there other examples of non-traditional materials like TPT, carbon, titanium, etc., that you're seeing now come up for auction that are similarly fetching, like, you know, good prices? Not necessarily because you know, they're titanium or whatever the metal may be, but because of their rarity or because there are very few in quantity produced. And then the kind of second half of that question is, I think part of the craze in steel is definitely driven by the interest in the auction market for these pieces in steel. And so do you see a similar trend arising as these pieces pick up you know, in valuations at auction, for that to then filter into the market for more modern pieces?
Thank you for the question. For the first part, Absolutely. Anytime, regardless of the metal used, if it's a rare bird in the production of a particular model, it's going to fetch a significant premium. If Patek Philippe made 200 examples of a model, and there's 3 examples in white gold, that white gold is going to fetch a premium maybe 10x the yellow gold what it would make. In some modern watches, you mentioned TPT. So Richard Mille watches of today are extremely sought after at the moment, and there were more traditional materials used for his cases, like white gold, rose gold, even titanium, that sell for a certain price. If we're selling a current production piece with a TPT colored case, or maybe a sapphire crystal case, because it's so recognizable, even though it's probably not more rare, but it's so recognizable, that price is going to be higher than the more traditional looking case, just because of the flash factor of Richard Mille. Richard Mille has created an amazing brand image where when somebody sees one on the person's wrist, they know that's a wealthy person, and people want that feeling and that recognition. And the TPT colored cases, sapphire crystal cases, those are where we're seeing the highest prices paid, even though they're not as rare as the earlier traditional material cased pieces. And then your second question was regarding pricing and how it trickles down into the regular market. Yes, because auctions, especially high-profile auctions that we hold just a couple times a year, are well watched by the watch community, including the trade. When we achieve a very high price for a certain model that may not be so rare, that shows the world, because it's very public, that people are willing to pay that much for a particular model, and sometimes dealers will reset their pricing based on auction results. It's very typical, whether it's watches, cars, art. This is the impact of public auctions, because it's a documented public transaction that shows someone who's willing to pay that price at that certain day, whereas dealer prices, they're advertised on a website, but you just don't know when they sell or what they sell for, because it's less transparent.
I'll also add to that it's a little bit frustrating if you're in the watch business as a collector or a dealer, that the most voluminous sales platform, Chrono24, gives you very little pricing history, close to none. eBay, which is also high volume, gives you a little bit more in completed auctions. Sometimes you could see sold for prices. And then auctions, which are the slowest and the lowest volume, actually give you the best pricing history. So it would be great if we could know what every watch selling on Chrono went for from a dealer and collector perspective, but auctions really are truly the best way to see, whether it's eBay or the big auction houses, your best window into what watches are actually selling for on a transaction basis.
We had one more question, I think. Yes.
Hi. So I have a question about if the Rolex and the Audemars Piguet are collectible without talking about the market influencing. So as I know, especially for Rolex, they don't have like a large variety of the movement. They only have like movements start from 3 and 4. But besides talking about the marketing, are they collectible? And also Rolex, they don't have like high-end technology like Breguet or Blancpain. They don't have perpetual calendars or tourbillon. And also, I also want to ask about how long does the bubble will last for the stainless steel watch?
Can you repeat the last part of your question?
I want to ask about how long does the bubble will last for the stainless steel watches?
You want to try that one, Aldous?
Hell no.
I'm happy to.
I'll tell you
answer
about the bubble. Like again, I don't know if it's something that it's a difficult. It's a difficult answer. I don't know. I mean, you would.
Nobody has a crystal ball. No one has a crystal ball. And what?
If I knew, I would.
The advice I have for anyone buying watches: buy what you love. Full stop. don't buy a watch as an investment. There are much
Yeah.
better investment vehicles than watches.
Yeah.
If the watch that you bought happens to go up in value, consider that a nice bonus. If the watch stays the same value, good bonus. If it goes down in value, at least you're stuck with a watch you love.
Yeah. I definitely concur. I mean, first, thank you for the question. It was a fantastic question. It's a terribly difficult question for us to address because it is something that there's no case study behind it. It's so random what fluctuates, but I agree, and I tell people, just like Paul, buy something that you feel, buy something that you stay with. Don't allow the market to influence your choices as a collector, because at the end of the day, it's your collection and you have to live with it. So I don't buy to go into a room and say, hey, look, I got this thing that's, I go to say, this is me. If it happens to be the same watch somebody else has, that's cool. We now can share something. We have a story that we can connect on, which is really fantastic. But if I have something completely unique, regardless of price, regardless of brand, but just something that's completely unique to me that I can go share with somebody else and introduce them to, like a brand like Hebdomus or Raqueta, where they're older brands, but they have some really interesting movement composition. That's a part of being a collector that I think it's the culture where we get to share stories, we get to really connect and communicate through these mechanical devices. So I would say, don't even worry about those questions. Just worry about what you like and snatch up what you want to snatch up and, hold on to it for as long as you can.
I always say buy something underrated now, and then you have nothing to worry about later. I do think it's reasonable to ask when the bubble will burst if you're paying $45,000 for a steel Daytona that, again, costs $13,000. So, yes, definitely buy what you like, but, we can see that these pricing scenarios are not normal. In general, what it's going to take to bring the bubble down is going to be an end of cheap money or some sort of economic contagion that causes people with a lot of money to feel less comfortable about spending it. I have a little saying that every recession is due to bad debt poorly understood, and there were a lot of reforms in the West following the economic meltdown of 2007 to 2009, whereas if you just recently noticed some of the kind of proto-contagion surrounding the finances of Evergrande in China, that's not even China's largest property developer, and there are many, many more like it. The debts are opaque, and the financial conditions of these companies are not well understood. So I think next time we see some sort of global economic downturn, you could see a serious hit to the $100,000 Patek Philippe Nautilus. I do think it'll originate via some sort of real estate debt or speculative debt. I think that's what'll cause it.
On that upbeat note, I would like to thank all of you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Aldous, Tim, Paul. Thank all of you for coming.
Thank you
Enjoy
for
the
coming.
last few hours.
Thank you all.
Appreciate y'all.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you, guys. Thank you.